Start.
Yes.
Very good evening. Namaste. I am Pratik Girpadgire, a student of law from Maharashtra National Law University. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Think India for giving us this platform for online discussion. Today we have two energetic young individuals, Mr. and Advocate Ashish Ji Sonavne, who is the co-moderator with me, Mr. Kiran Muthal, who will be the key speaker for today's session. Let me take this privilege to introduce Ashish Ji. Ashish Ji is a technological lawyer with extensive experience in the IT sector for the banking and finance services industry. He has worked for some of the top global banks. His specialization includes in the domain of finance crime and technology law and operates from Pune, Aurangabad and Mumbai. He is also the founder of the Nyayaniti Prabodhini, with a focus to enhance legal literacy and provide legal aid to the underprivileged section of the society. I would now request Ashish Ji to introduce Mr. Kiran Muthan, who is the key speaker for today's session.
Namaste, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be part of this discussion. And before introducing Kiran, let me give a brief background about today's topic and its relevance. So we all understand corruption and financial crime are two core topics which are related with the existence of every nation and society. Unless and until we have a society that is free of corruption, it is very difficult for us to achieve the development targets which we are eyeing for. Therefore, in today's discussion, we have Kiran with us to cover various aspects of corruption as well as financial crime. So, with this, I would also like to add a point that this event is something wherein we really want to have interdisciplinary discussion and dialogue among the audiences as well. Therefore, we strongly encourage all the viewers to please share your views and your thoughts in the chat section. You can reply on the Facebook message for the video post, and we can take your questions as well during the discussion. So with this, I'll now introduce Kiran. It's actually my honor and pleasure to introduce him. Kiran is based in US at New York for more than 11 years now. And Kiran works in the financial sector, and that too specializes in the risk area, wherein he deals with scenarios such as financial crime, anti-money laundering, sanctions, etc. It's also an honor to introduce Kiran. In a way, it's like introducing a friend who has immense knowledge, not only in his domain, but also in the India scenario. Therefore, with this introduction of Kiran, I would want Kiran to give a brief introduction and overview of the entire topic so that we'll have a fair understanding of what would be covered in today's session.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks, Pratik. Thanks for having me here. Thank you, Think India. So we are here today to discuss about corruption and financial crime. So if you pick up these two different things, corruption is something, a process to influence any decision. And that is not necessarily limited to government, but that can be spread across anywhere. Why you influence a decision is to gain a benefit out of it. And most likely that gain is either monetary or either from the influential power of position of influence. And you do that by giving some kickbacks, giving some money, or giving some favor to the person who is making the decision. So this phenomena occurs in both ways. And most common vehicle for this is money, because it's easy to transfer, it's a liquid, and it has an interoperability principle. So you can use money for a different reason and someone else can use it for a different reason. So it's easy to be transferred. And as money is transferred, financial aspect or financial crime aspect comes into the picture. As this is money which is not legitimate, money which is used for influencing certain decision, which is not a standard path. So the transfer of this money, storing of this money, use of this money has to be conducted in something which is outside the regular pattern or regular business. And if and that doesn't fit into the government set regulations. So it is a financial crime. If you are using money derived from corruption, if you are using money derived from the tax evasion, if you are using money derived from the bribery, or if you are using money derived from the any illegitimate reason, then it's part of a financial crime. Now, though financial crime is a very broad term, and that crime consists of multiple aspects. So it's not only using that money, but it also depends on who is using that money. So the person who is not fit or a high risk, or someone from the someone designated as not to do business with, if he is using that money, then if that money is being transferred to a certain high risk jurisdiction, and that's the sanction part. Government impose sanctions on certain countries based on the political and economic relationship with that country. So certain countries are using terrorism as a tool of aggression. So many countries have decided not to do business with those. Many countries have very loose tax regulations. So there are international bodies like FATF, they have decided not to do business with them. So transferring money to these high-risk jurisdictions is part of sanctions. That's also one of the financial crime. And there are few evolving areas in financial crime. I'll speak about that quickly, and then we can move to the next topic. So these two types are more to do with the fraud. So fraud is any kind of fraud. You must have seen this very famous series on Netflix, which is Jamtara, when you get a call and they ask you for your credit card details. And they might not directly ask your credit card details, but they ask you certain questions to get your bank information. So they ask you your date of birth, your wife date of birth, your wedding date, or something you might have used as your password or a password recovery question. And they gain all that information. So that's kind of a fraud. Fraud also has different types. So the one we spoke was about telephone fraud, but there are cyber frauds where someone hacks into your account. So all of these are part of financial crime. And why we are talking about this is if there is a corruption, there is a money movement involved. If there is a money movement involved in an illegitimate way, there is a financial crime involved. So all of these things, corruption and financial crime, are linked to each other and need to be evaluated and looked at from a comprehensive lens.
Of the topic, can you please explain what is corruption in monetary terms? Also, it is a general perception that corruption exists only in the government sector. Does it also exist in private sector? If yes, can you give some of the examples?
So these are the this is really interesting question. So when we see corruption, we always hear things related to scams in government, like a famous 2G scam or a Commonwealth scam, where we will speak about that. So corruption is very if you take these very famous example of that Commonwealth scam, where one roll of toilet paper was sold for n number of times of this original value. So that's like invoicing inflation, and that's a very common practice of corruption. So in the government, considering people have very stable jobs, earlier there used to be less accountability, or they consider their job and position indispensable. So there was a trend of doing anything, and that gave these things of selling this purchasing this toilet paper to the multiple times of the original cost. So that's a very common example of corruption. You buy something or you pay for something which is more than the actual value, and that's happening very commonly in government. But if you look at the private section, the private sector, the corruption type is a little bit different. In private sector, you are always held accountable for anything happening under your watch. And there is also a chance to losing your job. And now they have made laws so strict that you can even go to jail. So earlier, these financial crime cases were mostly civil in nature, but they are also considered as a criminal in nature, where you can't only run by paying penalties and fines, but you also face jail charges or jail time with these cases. And a very common example of corruption in the private sector, which is also linked to the government sector, is or can have a dual nature, is the corruption in arms trade. So in the corruption in the arms trade, if you look at the few examples, there are private companies who are selling these arms and ammunition in Europe, and their costs are too high. So one Eurofighter costs around 96 million, and one Sukhoi costs around 55 million. So think about, if so much money is involved in just one quantity, then you have a lot of buffer to play with. So that's a completely another market. Then there are a few different type of corruption in private sector. So the financial institutions are used as a vehicle to launder money, but financial institutions sometimes are also got fined because of the financial crime or irregularities in them. So there is a different type of corruption in private sector, which is to gain profit and doing certain activities like speculative trading or doing some insider trading, which is illegitimate and unlawful.
Thank you, Kiran, for this explanation and the impact of the corruption in a way. However, if we consider scenario of our nation, probably if we go back, let's say, for a period which was 10 years ago, right, when we were hit by scams after scams, and the magnitude of the scams were massive, huge, and the example of 2G scam which you have given, it's the kind of impact of that scam and magnitude was so huge, that it was very difficult even to comprehend the losses which the taxpayer and the nation which has suffered because of it. So this brings me to a question, why this corruption is such a big factor, and is this corruption the sole reason for the tag of India as a developing country for decades? I remember still when we were in the school, we were still calling ourselves as developing nation. And after spending, let's say, around 15-20 years in the industry, we are still developing nation. So when will we actually get rid of the developing nation tag and become a developed nation? Can you please throw some light around it and share impact of the corruption on the society as a whole?
So I like this question, and I'll tell you what. If we want to become a developed nation, what we want, we need, if I can explain that in one word, we need Antyodaya. In a simple language, that means we need to transfer the development which is being reached at the top layer of the society to someone who is standing on the last step of the ladder of societal hierarchy. So that's the concept of Antyodaya Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay ji put forward. And that's very relevant in this context. When we hear these scams and when we hear about money which is being stashed outside or stolen from the people, then we just hear that, oh, 1 lakh crore, 20,000 crore, 50,000 crore. But as it's not impacting my day-to-day life, so we don't understand the magnitude of it. But if you think where that money came from, then you realize it's our own money. When we pay taxes, that money gets into government, and that money has been stolen from government. So it's ultimately our money, which government was supposed to use for our benefit, and it's not being used. So our concept of Antyodaya is somewhere lacking in that perspective, and it has a cascading impact. So I was reading a few years back about Transparency International and their report. So India ranks 76th on Transparency International. So the transparency in doing business, transparency in transaction is number 76. There are 75 countries ahead of us. But if you look at the Bribers Players Index, we rank 19th. That means there are only 18 countries ahead of us in the Bribers Players Index out of these, 190 countries in the world. And that means there are 170 countries where you don't have to or pay less bribe compared to India. That's really not a good reason. So if you consider India in terms of mass, land mass, population, GDP, we rank much higher. But still, we are also lacking in developing a mechanism where we can get our work done without paying a bribe. And as this money gets stolen, the government can't use it. It doesn't go to the next section. It can't be used for schools, medical facilities, and that's what's stopping us from becoming a developed country from a developing country. But there are a few ways where government should work on and is doing that will reduce the corruption in the process. And I'm not talking about any only government process, but I'm also talking about corruption in the private sector. You have to remember that money laundering came into picture like 30 years back, 35 years back, as an official tool to monitor the money movement in banks. There were certain regulations, but not a specific banking regulation. Then sanctions came. So these things are evolving. In the recent trend, we are developing a concrete mechanism for anti-bribery and corruption. There are very few companies in the world which developed a dedicated product for monitoring anti-bribery and corruption transactions. So it's being developed, and I'm hopeful that it needs to be countered in multiple ways. Government needs to have some strict measures about countering corruption, and we can talk about it in detail after a few minutes. But it is also a responsibility of private organizations. I'm not talking about private citizen. It's our own responsibility not to pay bribe and not to get involved in corruption, but that's part of it. But it's a role of private organizations to develop banks to monitor the bribery or bribery transactions, or monitor the tax evasion related transactions and report the suspicious transactions to the government. That will curb a lot of corruption if you can't move that money which is earned from corruption outside.
Well, thank you, Kiran, for this positive outlook and reference to the Antyodaya scheme by Pandit Deen ji. I just want to bring one point here. Just a day before, our Prime Minister has addressed the nation on the background of the Corona, and wherein he has, given a very positive message about Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I want to have your views and insight about Atmanirbhar Bharata and Antyodaya and its joint link, basically, to get rid of corruption and have Make in India, so that we can actually get into the developed nation tag. I just want to hear from you and your thoughts.
This is really I guess unexplored territory yet, because Antyodaya and Atmanirbhar Antyodaya is well-developed concept. Last 50 years we are using it. There are organizations which are working on the concept of Antyodaya, but Atmanirbhar is something derived from the Swadeshi movement, which is also being in place for last 30 years, I guess. So if you think about the current situation where we export a lot of things from cheap market economies or cheap labor economies, where labor is cheap, so they can produce that good at low cost, and we export that, so our money goes outside our country. In the Antyodaya concept, we want to reach out to the every section of society. So if something can be developed in a cheap labor outside, why can't it be developed in the cheap labor in the India? So there are two concepts we need to identify. First, giving a job to or reaching out to everyone in the society and making them empowered, but also more importantly, identify our strength. Is India a free labor market for all countries? And is that the domain we want to develop as other countries in Southeast Asia? Or we want to develop our domain and expertise in the world as a strong knowledge base and a service industry? Remember, we can't lead on all efforts at the same time. So I believe that we have to identify what's our domain, develop our expertise in that, and as we develop our expertise in that, we should be we will be reaching out to every section of society, and then it is a part to Atmanirbhar. Corruption will go down as if we develop our expertise in knowledge base, we will bring more digitalization. That's the first step in reducing corruption. And very, very simple example. If you have a decision to be made in the government, and that decision is not digitalized, not automated, then there is a majority chance of manual intervention on that decision. But if you make that decision automated, like few years back, Gujarat government did teacher selection process automated. They just took an online test, and first certain number of students who got more marks, they were given a rank, or they were given an appointment. So if you make that process automated, there is no manual intervention, and as no manual intervention, there is no chance of influencing the process. That will automatically reduce the corruption process. So I guess going digital and digitalization is a key to reduce the corruption.
Thank you, Kiran, for this wonderful insight. And I think if we need to blame someone in this entire process, then I think it is the individual instinct, to find those loopholes and what we call is primarily Niji Swarth in Hindi, right? So wherein people are interested in terms of their shallow motives, and that is where all these corrupt practices are born, or actually they take shape. My friend Pratik here has a question about tax evasion. So Pratik, why don't you go ahead and ask the question?
Yeah, firstly, I would like to thank both of you for drawing an excess of Sanskrit term with the corruption. So basically, what is tax evasion? Can it be termed as a kind of corruption, and then bribery is used as a tool to hide these corrupt practices?
Corruption is anything which is not a standard phenomenon. If you're not doing that in a legal manner, it's a corruption. Tax evasion is very simple terms. If you earn $100, if you earn 100 rupees, you have to pay 30 rupees tax on it. If you don't pay that tax and keep 30 rupees to yourself, all 100 rupees to yourself, that's tax evasion, and that has a long-term impact. Out of these 30 rupees which you are paying to government, you are getting back certain amount of it in terms of facilities you are using, the roads you are using, schools you are using, libraries you are using, water supply you are using. So you are going to get certain amount back to you. You are losing that. That's the first part. Second part, government is lacking money to work on its priorities. So we are also doing kind of a Deshdroha if we are not paying taxes appropriately on our money. And so it's a criminal offense. If you have that money earned from the tax evasion, there is another challenge. You cannot show that money in the mainstream channel of doing business, because that money is not accounted. You have earned that money, but you have not shown it because you don't want to pay taxes on it. Now you can't bring that to mainstream. That means you are encouraging alternative mean of doing a business that will also an illegitimate way which won't pay taxes. So if you skip 30 rupees of tax for your own benefit, was Ashish were talking about, then you are encouraging more money to get lost in the entire process in tier 2, tier 3 manner. as it goes into other illegitimate ways of business.
Thank you, Kiran. And this is where I think that Lobha component actually comes in among the Shadaripu's, wherein everybody wants just little more, and that gives birth to the tax evasion, as you very rightly explained it. So Kiran, there is another angle to this tax evasion scheme, right? Tax evasion is something which is after earning, but we have seen a phenomena wherein people were borrowing for their businesses, and whatever they borrowed, with which they build their empires, they actually have extravagant lives. However, in the end, what happened is that these people doomed. They didn't pay back their debt. And now an interesting angle is coming in wherein certain banks were asked to give credit facilities or loans to certain people. Now, the question here is that why give loans to some of the people only for them to get default at a later point in time? So I want your views on it. We have seen number of cases in this regard. And latest examples are actually PMC Bank and Yes Bank. However, there is a string of such things. We just would like to hear it from you.
So I would take a step back and explain this in a broader concept. And I have a theory which I'm talking about since last few years, where in the current world or in the current regulatory world, there are two different risks identified in the banking or financial world, which are dealt by different regulations. You have a lending risk or a credit risk, which you are talking about, where people take loan and then they don't pay loan back, which is a default, and that's a credit risk. And there is another risk, which is a financial crime risk, which is dealt by transaction monitoring or customer due diligence, by identifying if that customer is a appropriate customer to do the business with bank. These two worlds are having their own regulations, having their own electronic monitoring system, and performing their jobs. My theory is these two systems needs to be tied up together because they have a very close relationship with each other. As you rightly said, people do financial crime with the money earned, but even before earning money, they take a loan and do a financial crime. So that's an phenomena where we can join these two worlds of credit risk and financial crime together and have a joint mechanism on it. So I was reading a report. There is around 5,000 crore outstanding default loans in India, out of which I guess 25% or 1/4 of the loans are only from 12 individuals. So if you put that in a context, that there are only 12 people who have majorly looted the Indian economy, and they ran away out of it. So if you consider the credit risk and financial crime aspect together, the people who applied for the loan, if they would have checked for their customer due diligence, their records, their historical payments, and not only limited to that, but their travel records, their business records, their related parties like their brother, their sister, their business interest, what are their future acquisitions and mergers, what are their plans, what are their projected growths, then it would have been more appropriate to develop their entire profile, and then bank would have made a more balanced decision of not giving them a loan. Now, considering here that bank has not done anything willfully blind. Willfully blind is bank knew that they were going to evade or they were going to default in the later, and still they gave them loans. So if we even leave that scenario and keep bank out of our suspicion, then still use of data, use of technology would have helped to create a comprehensive futuristic looking profile of certain individuals, and then bank would have made a decision of not paying them loan. In the later part, let's assume bank still paid them loan because they were better working individuals. But if bank continuously evolve their profile and bank continuously monitor their transactions, then it would have been easier for bank to predict that these people are going to default in next 1 year or 2 years or whatever timeline it is. And then bank would have acted more appropriately, informed the government authorities, moved towards their mortgage acquisitions, and identified a way to recover that loan. But as you see, these two things are working in entire silo. Creating a customer profile and monitoring transactions is a silo, and credit risk monitoring is a silo. So as these two things are not tied up together, it was very difficult for banks to identify who is going default and how they can stop that. And everything considering that every banks are doing a fair play. I'm not even talking about if someone insider of a bank was involved or was hand in glove with one of the borrower, and and despite of knowing that they are going to default, he still pay them. So if we even keep that aside, it was possible to stop these kind of frauds.
Very interesting scenario, Kiran, right? Credit risk is something which is totally ignored. In fact, credit risk, it appears that credit risk defaulters, I mean to say those who score badly on credit risk scores, were preferred in terms of giving the loans. And obviously, since loan was given with an intention, that's why surveillance and monitoring failed. I think that is where the topic of today's session comes in picture, that is corruption. So there is a link of corruption between credit risk and financial crime. That is what we are witnessing. Rather, I would say that is what we witnessed earlier. And now there are counter mechanisms which are in place, and hopefully the situation would be better the days to come. And I think you would explain it in the later part of this discussion. So very quickly,
it's a very. I would like to just interject and say one thing. Corruption is a human phenomenon. As human mind touches every aspect of the world, corruption can also touch every aspect of the world. So keep that in your mind. Now, next thing is emerging world of data and information sharing. As you have data about everything, we have data about what we are talking now, data about my car going through a toll booth, my data about my phone calls, data about every single damn thing what we are doing. We leave digital footprint of everything. So these data points are available, and these data points needs to be connected. So without going into much technical details of it, I believe government as well as private organization are working towards developing a mechanism where they can identify required data attributes to predict the future as in terms of financial activities. And that is not far from now.
Thank you, Kiran. Very quickly, I just want to have your inputs about the tax evasion and money laundering, right? And the interplay actually, which typically happens here in terms of tax saving and that results into generation of black money. So, can you please throw some perspective around it? Maybe some historical examples and examples that would actually help us to understand.
Yeah. So tax evasion is a very common phenomenon of not paying taxes. If you get that money to you, you have to put that money somewhere where you can use it. So people are using we hear about black money. So that's the money earned out of illegitimate market. And the other term which we use here about black money is Swiss bank. So the tax evasion or the money which has been earned from the tax evasion has to be stacked somewhere in a country which is considered as tax haven. So what is tax haven? Tax haven is country with the loose tax regulations. And why we say Swiss bank? Because Switzerland has very loose regulations around banking. There is a 1937 Swiss regulation, which was very useful in Second World War, where you don't have to declare or you don't have to you have to fill your credit customer details, but bank does not have to declare these details to government. So that regulation was very much used in Second World War, where people who were victim of Second World War hide their money into Swiss banks, and it was not being able to recover by any of the winning powers. But that good law is being misused now, where Swiss banks are not disclosing name of their customers to the government. That's what stopping us from, and that is what is tax haven. So as there was a lot of Swiss in long time, but Switzerland is not the only country which is used as tax haven. And when we say Swiss bank, there is no central bank of Switzerland per se where people go and stack their money. There are banks in every corner in Switzerland where people use to launder their money. There are different countries like Cayman, Belize, British Virgin Island, Montserrat, Island of Isle. These are also used as a tax haven because Switzerland is also getting crowded and it's very difficult to get Swiss citizenship. But in other countries, you can easily acquire your citizenship. These countries sell their citizenship. I'll tell you a very classic example of Nauru. It's an island in the Pacific Ocean near the coast of Australia. So that island got independence from British few years back, and after that, they discovered some mines. So all money started pouring in, and politicians got too much money from mines. And I don't want to blame politicians, but they were greedy in Nauru. So they identified alternative ways to even earn money, and they opened their banking system for anyone who can come in. You don't have to fill up the customer due diligence form. They don't perform credit checks on it. They don't perform a watch list check, which is if he's a terrorist, if he's a politically exposed person, kind of checks on it. But he can directly go and deposit money with no questions asked. And you wouldn't imagine, there is a famous case of a Russian money launderer who laundered more than $70 billion, which is a huge amount, from this bank in Nauru. So in 2002, if you remember, there was a war going on between America and Iraq in 2001 after 9/11. So in 2002, America imposed even difficult sanctions on Nauru than that of Iraq. And then Nauru realized that our country will go down if we continue this criminal route. So there is an international monitoring body which is called FATF, Financial Action Task Force. They also put Nauru on the watch list, that Nauru's business should be monitored. All the banking regulations with Nauru, banking relationship with Nauru should be monitored. And Nauru worked with FATF. And in the next 3 to 4 years, FATF took off Nauru from their watch list. And Nauru now has a sustained economy. They are facing different challenges due to immigration and other issues, but leaving that aside, their banking system, economical system was going towards south, but they fixed it in 3 to 4 years, and it's developing now. So it's not completely impossible to fix a banking system of a country and get them to more transparent system, more digitalized system, not helping them with the money launderers and terror financing. I guess only important aspect there is political will. So these are multiple tax havens. People, funny part in the tax haven, is that they sell citizenship. So if you might have heard the recent case that one of the Indian businessmen who ran away from India and hid somewhere in Central America. When government started to extradite him, government realized that this businessman has acquired citizenship of a different country. And how do you acquire? There are many countries in the world who just sell their citizenship for few $100,000. Few $100,000 is what? $100,000 is 70 lakh. So if you and corrupt officials or businessmen have too much money than 70 lakh. So they can easily spend 70 lakh to get a citizenship of a country from where they cannot be extradited because that country doesn't have an extradition treaty with India. So that's another blooming business now. So you get the citizenship of that country that gives you access to the entire banking system of that country. That country already has loose banking regulations, and you can route your all transactions through that country. So this is the other thing with tax haven happening nowadays.
Thank you, Kiranji. Can you please throw light on these things with some of the examples from India and across the world?
Yes. So the first thing about citizenship that I just spoke about. So one of the businessmen got a citizenship and now he cannot be extradited back. That's the very common thing. Other thing about doing business through these tax havens. There is an article in Diplomat yesterday by Cleo Pascal that speaks explicitly about corruption in Indian political system and how money has been laundered from India to outside. So when you think about laundering money outside to India, how would you launder? You have to create a certain company which will do your businesses. So I'll give you another example of it. India, uh, in Africa, there is a country called Mauritius. You all must have familiar with that country because that country has more than half of people from Indian origin. So India has a very good relationship with Mauritius. Indian government did some treaty with Mauritius, which allowed people from Mauritius or the incorporations which are in Mauritius to do easily business with India without having or with the less taxes or without double taxation. So they were getting a lot of tax benefits out of it. So what many people did is they created something called shell companies. So shell company is you just create a firm for the sake of creating it. You don't have employees, you don't have a fixed structure, you don't that firm is not doing any business. That firm might not be even paying taxes in that country. That firm might not be employing full-time employees, having a permanent office in that country. And that these and most of the businessmen carried out their business through these shell companies in Mauritius. So it is called a letterbox company. They had a post box address in Mauritius, and from that post box address they started doing the business. And this all tax document was sent to this post box address in Mauritius. So they were not paying any taxes. That's the easy way many businessmen did to avoid the taxes. So that's the another part of money laundering. The other example which I would like to give is of the shell company. How do you create a shell company? You just don't create a shell company by an individual, but you can also create a shell company by different corporations. So let's take an example where someone creates a shell company. Person A creates a shell company, person B creates a shell company. And then all these two shell companies come together and they create a third shell company. So there is no way to identify where this thing started and who is the original owner of it. And people do businesses through these layered shell companies where you cannot trace who is the original owner, you don't pay taxes, and they launder money through it. Now, there are even stricter laws in the American market, in the American regulatory world, with the US Patriot Act, where they can identify shell companies based on if they're paying taxes in that land, if they have a full-time employee in that land, how much money they owe, money they business in, what are their last year's records. And American market is doing really well in identifying shell companies. I guess other market should be doing that soon. There are a few international bodies like Wolfsburg regulations. They have some stricter regulations on or guidance for identifying shell companies. Most of the European countries are also using that nowadays. Indian government also performed a check of how many corporations are shell corporations in India, and they got reduced of majority of shell corporations in last few years.
Thank you, Kiran, for this elaborate view on shell companies. I think shell companies was also in terms of the news and discussions in terms of election funding as well some time ago. So this crackdown by Indian government was also news a while ago about the shell companies. However, I would like to know about some of the strategies which are in place in general across the globe and in India, wherein all the different ways or the methods through which the money laundering and corruption activities can be tamed. So I would request you to please throw some light on it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. If you want to counter money, you have to think in the global perspective, because though corruption is happening in a localized phenomena, the outcome of that corruption, which is money, is not being restricted to that region. If corruption happening in India, that money is being sent to Swiss banks, like we hear all the time in news. If corruption is happening somewhere in Africa, that's also money is sent to some European bank or somewhere in the Caribbean nation for the tax haven purposes. That gives them an ability to stealthily stack their money. So no one will know that where is that, if that person holds an account and how much money he has, though if government wants to tackle it. So now it's a global phenomena. It needs to be tackled in a global manner. And we can start from global manner, but and go down slowly to the domestic or institutional level of how this phenomena should be tackled. In the global market, there are few regulatory bodies. There is a Walsberg regulation. There is a Financial Action Task Force. There is a Basel Committee of Banking Supervision, and they regularly provide guidance on how money laundering should be tackled. They provide guidance about how terror financing can be tackled, how individual customer needs to be identified, what are the emerging risk typologies, how you can identify that money is not from legitimate purpose. And though it's not mandatory for governments to implement that, but most of the governments are implementing it because these bodies, especially FATF, that gives a country-specific rating. So they evaluate every country, and their process is very interesting. They evaluate the country risk for the banking business, and then they put that country in the gray, white, or blacklist. So white is perfectly fine; you don't have to worry about it. Gray is a country with the particular concern. So Pakistan is in the gray list because it is suspected to be providing funding to the terrorist organizations. And that's a completely different topic. We can speak about how terror financing is happening, how to identify that, and what are the ways to curb that. But Pakistan was on the gray list, and there are only two countries on the blacklist. There are North Korea and Iran. So there are very strict sanctions about what business you can do with countries on the blacklist. So North Korea and Iran, you cannot do direct business. You cannot go and buy something directly from Iran. There are certain list of products and commodities only which you can buy from Iran. In return of that, it is very also limited what you can sell to Iran. You cannot sell weapons. You cannot sell missiles to Iran. Similarly with North Korea. So there are international bodies which are doing these things. But it's also important that out of these all 190 countries, each country plays their role correctly. So we don't want to live in a utopian or idealistic world where everything is nice. FATF is doing their job, but if countries don't do their job, then FATF's work is not sufficient. We just saw about tax evasion countries or tax haven countries. These countries allow or harbor money laundering. Then these countries need to act very strictly on the FATF and Walsberg regulations, where they can perform a due diligence on an individual customer. If you have an embassy official coming to open an account in your bank, you have to evaluate him very properly, saying, oh, why is he opening an account in my bank? Is he going to use my bank for the official business, or is he going to use my bank for the personal business? If he is going to use for official business, what kind of business is he going to do? Is he going to harm anything to my country? Is he going to have any business impacts? Is it going to have any terror funding related issues? So bank need to evaluate all these things for any individual who is opening an account. So not only embassy officials, but any foreign national, any high risk individual, any politically exposed person, any person who is on the government list of not to do business with. Bank need to evaluate that they are doing it. Once bank evaluate and gets onboards him, bank has to also monitor that he is not involved any of the suspicious activities. And how you do that? We just saw in corruption, you have very common phenomena where you can just inflate an invoice and you can get more money out of it. So bank has to monitor every transaction for this from the suspicious lens. And how you do that is to find a rationale behind that transaction. If you are selling toilet rolls for $2 million. Then you have to see how many time controllers you have sold. Is it the right price in the market? What is his commission on it? What's the profit he is going to get on it? What is the shipping cost? So, and then bank has to evaluate if that fits in the particular scenario or not. If that doesn't fit, then bank has to report that to the government, and government also has to act on it. So it's a collective responsibility, or something which is called a public-private partnership in the recent world, which is more important to deal the corrupt money coming out of it. If you see all these tax haven countries, except Switzerland, most of these countries are islands. And it's easy for islands to become a tax haven because it's easy for them to open a shell company. And also it's easy because most of the shell companies are created as a part of shipping corporations. And as shipping corporations needs to have an office in the island or near to sea, they prefer these islands to open their shell offices. So it's all interlinked. And government has to provide. And now in the public-private partnership, there is a new trend coming up. At least in America, government is working with few major banks in America, where government will provide specific inputs to these banks. I'll tell you the major challenge. In the now forget the tax haven countries, but in the major economies which are mature or developed, or which have very regular anti-bribery, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering laws, if they fail to report an alert, they get fined. Many of the major banks in the world have got fined in America, in Europe, even in India, for failing to report the suspicious transaction. So what they're doing now is they're over-reporting. Just want to avoid any fine, they're reporting anything which comes into their plate. And that will save them by saying, oh, we already reported it, but that will increase the pressure on investigators or regulators, saying they have to, earlier where they had to review only 10 alerts, now they have to review 1,000 alerts, which is a painful thing nowadays. So there is a public-private partnership going on in the bank, and without being more technical, I'll just say that now government will provide specific input to the bank, saying, oh, now I think that shipping thing will take a pace and there will be a lot of money laundering through shipping. Or as oil market is going down, we believe that there can be a suspicious transaction happening in the oil market. So just focus on oil market. And bank will act on these government provided inputs, which will help them to counter these money laundering in much financial crime, much effective manner.
Thank you, Kiran. And the way you actually explained it, the scenario of over surveillance, under surveillance, reporting, due diligence, KYC. I think the idea which many of people out here have is that KYC means giving other detail. That's it. But the other dimensions which you actually brought in terms of politically exposed persons, what are the backgrounds, how they are doing business, what are the rationale behind the transaction? Had we have these policies in place, probably Commonwealth scam for which toilet paper was sold at a massive price would not have occurred. So I think that is something for which implementation is something which is key in the Indian scenario. However, I would like to bring in an interesting point. This is what something global efforts are at as of today. However, if we see the challenging time which is coming, or rather which has already arrived in a way, that is about the dark web and utilization of tokens, wherein bitcoins and blockchain-based tokens are used as an exchange, and several other things are already happening in terms of regulatory standpoint in the US. However, if we link Bitcoin to the scenario which we just talked about, what would be the future course of action? Can you just throw some light on it?
This is really an interesting topic, and we can have a dedicated 1 hour session on this Bitcoin and the challenges coming out of Bitcoin. So I'll leave it with a thought which viewers can think about and read more about it. So your current currencies, we have rupees, we have euros, we have dollars, we have yen, or ruble, whatever currency. These are localized in nature. You can use these currencies only in India, Europe, America, Russia, Japan, China, China, whatever. But with the emergence of these Bitcoin, these are easily transferable without having their devaluation or the currency exchange. So that's one of the game-changing idea nowadays, where you will not have a currency like if you have in rupees and then you have to put it in Swiss bank, then you have to take that money outside India, you have to convert that money into euro, and then you have to deposit it in Swiss bank. But this is a game-changing idea, which you just have to use that Bitcoin which you have in India and transfer it without any devaluation, without any currency exchange to other part of the world and use it there. So though it has benefits, it also has challenges because it maintains a lot of anonymity about the user of Bitcoin. So I leave with the thought that this is a really nice, interesting idea which might change the course of our economy in the future. But there is also a difficult time ahead where you won't be able to monitor who is behind that Bitcoin and to misuse it.
Thank you, Kiran,
What are the-
for your perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, Pratik, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are the Bharatiya counter strategies on this?
So when you think about Bharatiya counter strategies or Indian counter strategies, government is working on first identifying individuals who are doing business, and that might not be individual, but that might be also entities. And government has recently got rid of majority of shell corporations which are doing business in India, which are running few illegitimate transactions. Once you got them out of Indian economy, then your individual actor who is involved in the transaction is gone. That gets a lot of curbing on the actual transaction. Then government is putting a lot of regulations on monitoring of transactions and reporting of transactions. And that's at the domestic level, but at the international level, government should be working, and I believe it might be working with international bodies, which are regulatory bodies, but also at the international different countries. Like recently, government has put an extradition request for Vijay Mallya in Europe, in London. So that's one of the way to tackle that financial crime, where when people will have a fear that if you do a crime and run away to a different country, you won't be spared and you will be extradited and face the justice. So that will also help in reducing the financial crime.
All right.
Thank you, Kiran, for your inputs. We have some comments and questions from our audiences as well. Now let's take some of the comments and questions. So we'll take first question, which is coming from Ashwini Pradhanji, and her question is about the governments are government of India is making certain changes with reference to laws to bring transparency. But what about the subsequent governments if they actually overturn the laws which were made earlier? And she has cited example of Maharashtra. So what are your comments and thoughts on this question, Kiran?
Yeah, that's again boils down to the political will. And very recent example I gave about Nauru, where the political will that can bring that country from FATF blacklist to FATF whitelist. Now, with the transparency laws, there are stricter data privacy laws and transparency laws in place in the global market. So the transparency laws, which I think are might be localized in nature, and I'm not aware about the exact law which we are talking about here, which Maharashtra government has reversed. But if you look at the larger context, there are data privacy laws in the Europe, in America, and most of the banks have also expanded their scope across the world. So it might impact a section of bank which are doing business only limited to jurisdiction, but the major banks and which are a vehicle for laundering money. Because, and I'm saying that because these multinational banks are the one which have offices in India as well as in tax haven countries and used to launder money, won't be affected by reversing this privacy law, because they have to be complied with laws of land in the both jurisdiction.
Thanks, Kiran. I think her question was about same thing. Certain online processes of recruitment were scrapped by Maharashtra government, and I think your answer suffice that. Now we have next question from Jyotiraj Pathak ji, and what he says is this is about the Prime Minister's comment, and what he's saying is that self-reliant and globalization are the contrary. Do you have any inputs on it?
I will try to answer this, but this is something going out of my realm of the subject. But I would say that in the Hindu or Bharatiya philosophy, we are talking about two things. So first thing is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and other thing is Antyodaya. So your globalization is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and self-reliant is being independent and reaching out to every section of society. So these things, I don't believe they're contradictory. And globalization is opening doors of opportunities where Indian skilled labor or the scientist, service providers can go outside India and perform and help other countries to do a better job, and bring that, and also go to developed countries and bring that development into India. The question which I'm seeing is human development index of India is poor. How to improve that? And I'm sure there are, you are looking at the Human Resource Development Department, where they are doing the Skill India program to develop the skill index of human resources in India. So it's not only limited to the high-tech sector of AI and machine learning, but it also goes back to the smaller mid-scale job where government is working on developing skills in that area too.
Next question is about how politicians manage these scams. I think it's all about.
Yeah, so that question is politicians manage this scam because there is a less fear of law, I guess. And then if there are, so I would not only say less fear of law. I will bring back the point which I have spoken about before. Politicians can do that scam because it's in their hand. If you take these things out of their hand, if you take the manual intervention out of it, then you won't be able to perform a scam. Let's take your fodder example. Fodder example, people were allowed to give these tenders or pass these tenders, or who will give them fodder. If you put that in a very quantitative and automated manner, and fodder was 30 years back, so it was not possible, but in the current context, if you put that in more structured manner, let's take very nice example, fodder example. So you have to put a framework. You need a fodder for what kind of livestock, what kind of fodder they eat, what is their protein value, what is their food value, how much quantity you need, which area you want to provide. And if you put these quantitative parameters in place, and then suppliers have to fill up their answer sheet and generate a cost. And this will be very quantitative, and based on the cost they have given, government will perform certain automated checks. These will be driven by mathematics and data behind it. And government will identify first 5 vendors who can provide fodder and issue them a contract. It will serve both ways. The vendors who are issuing the fodders, they will always compete for the quality because it will be driven by the automated selection process. So you will always get best quality of product. Government will also get in less money because they are competing against each other. So they are trying to provide in a less quality. And the third more important factor is it will be more quality driven, and they can be held accountable about the things which are happening, which they are delivering after their tender is issued.
Thank you, Kiran.
World order is entirely changing. McKinsey issued a report in 2010 about big data. That still, at that time, it was still in the development phase. But now your every data point is recorded. If you send a WhatsApp text on your cell phone, it gets recorded. So that data needs to be used every place. If India has 1.3 billion population, then we have so many data points for one person. How many text messages he is sending? What food is he eating? Where is he driving? How many people he is talking to? What are his earnings? What are his spendings? So all these data points can be tied up together to predict a future, and that will reduce the scam. If you make these decisions based on the data and science, that will help them to reduce the scam.
Thank you, Kiran, for this elaborate answer. And I think we've already seen some of these examples after the launch of Digital India and the new policy for allotment of government works. And I will take just last question and then stop for the day. This question is from Pradeep Moore. It's all about the scenario after lockdown. Do we see more incidents of financial crime happening, or what is your take on it?
So yes, I'll quickly speak about this. Any crime is impacted by the events happening around. If you have lockdown, that means your banks are not open. So your manual entry to the bank is restricted, and you will be doing a lot of businesses on the phone or on the internet. Consider again, these all things are tied up together. If you are doing this business on the phone and internet, then you face the challenge of data security and cyber attack. So you might see a financial crime happening after lockdown because of the various reasons. And let's talk from the corruption perspective. Corruption perspective, Prime Minister yesterday announced 20 lakh crore package for economy, which is 10% of our GDP. So people are going to get their money. Now, if that money is not delivered through the proper channel of Janadhan Aadhaar card linked to Janadhan account and identifying the right individual who is entitled to receive the money, then it's bound to have some corruption in that area. So that's the first challenge. So government also has to digitalize, put a customer profile for individual user and identify who are the appropriate receivers or beneficiaries for these package and give them money. That's the first part. Second part is about financial crime in that area, which I already spoken about. Bank has to enhance their infrastructure, increase their firewalls for any kind of cyber security. And at the individual level, we also need to be aware about what kind of challenges or financial crime occurrences can happen with us. And I encourage everyone to watch that Jamtara on Netflix, which is a really nice example of how you should not respond to a phone call coming from a bank. Or if you remember one scene from the Bunty and Bubbly where Abhishek Bachchan goes to someone's home and asks him for his credit card details, and that person gives him credit card details. So at individual level, we need to be always alert about our bank transaction and details and not to share our details with anyone.
Well, thank you, Kiran. There is one question from Shekhar. Would you like to take that very briefly?
Yes, I can answer that.
Yeah.
So that question has two components to it. First, the question is, corporate strategy should be designed to tackle the politically exposed person while investing in overseas company. So that has two aspects. First is politically exposed person, and second is overseas company. So let's take the overseas companies first, because that's going to be the local jurisdiction. So let's assume it's a corporation from America having an office in Cayman Island. So it will be governed by both jurisdiction, Cayman Island jurisdiction as well as American jurisdiction. So that overseas company has to comply with both laws and get the information from that politically exposed person and risk rate him accordingly to see this if it is a high risk or low risk, to monitor this transaction appropriately. Now, most of the developing countries which have matured banking regulation system, they tend to offboard high-risk individuals, mostly falling in the politically exposed person category, or restrict their transactions for any cross-border businesses. If you are talking about an overseas corporation which is in the Cayman Island or in the tax haven, then they don't perform much of the CVD or due diligence on that customer, and they would allow the politically exposed person to do the business on it. But to make this answer short, overseas corporation should comply with law of land, also with the law of their home office, to appropriately monitor the politically exposed person. And not only monitor as in his risk profile, but also monitor his transactions and sanctions part.
Hello. Yeah. Kiran?
Yes.
Yeah. You're not audible in the last part, probably. Okay. All right, but I think Shekhar must have got his answer. You want to add anything more to that, Kiran?
No, what I was saying is overseas corporations have to design a strategy based on the both jurisdiction, their home office jurisdiction and the law of land, to monitor profile as well as transactions or activity for a politically exposed or a high risk individual.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kiran, for joining the session and answering the questions. I think it must have been a very enriching experience for everyone who have attended this session. And I think we would like to have many more of such sessions and understanding about some of the intricate topics, like PEP, politically exposed person. Who are they? So I think each of the segments which you have covered, I think deserve a dedicated session on it, so that the understanding.
It needs an individual session. Yes, that is correct.
Exactly. So, on behalf of the organizers, Think India and Anindya Prabodhini, I thank everyone who participated in this session. And just a small request, please like our Facebook page if you're already not liked. It's Facebook /Think India, and also subscribe our YouTube channel. With this, over to you, Pratik, for concluding comments.
Yeah, I would like to thank both of you, especially Kiran ji, for enlightening us with the overview of financial crimes and corruption across the world. And also, I would like to thank Ashish ji for his enriching ideas regarding the cryptocurrency, bitcoins, and many virtual currencies. Thank you.
No, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.